the end of the Queen's reign was an important symbolic break, because, I mean, she'd been there for 70 years at the end of the Great British Empire. Like, she kind of was the last bit of glow on, and we had to kind of readjust ourselves. The problem also is that we've, severed our links with Europe, and in many ways, America has severed its links with Britain and with Europe. And so Britain has been kind of left isolated, and it's back to a series of nation states like the 19th century, creating alliances and shifting loyalties. And that doesn't create a great deal of stability.
Welcome back to Global Power Shift. I'm Jim Stenman, joined as always by my co-host Suzanne Kianpour, who is still in sunny Italy. Special thanks to everyone for tuning in. Please support this show by following us at Global Power Shifts on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Instagram as well. Our guest today is Dr. Andrew Lownie. He's the historian and royal biographer whose book entitled became the Royal Book of the Year and helped strip Prince Andrew, formerly Prince Andrew, we should say, out of his titles. But here's the real reason that we wanted to have him on as a guest today. Is the UK lost as a country in 2026? The days of the empire are long gone, and just in the last decade, the country has lost two of its great anchors, one being the Queen, of course, the late Queen, and its place in Europe as well with Brexit. The country has churned through 6 prime ministers, and it looks like there's a 7th now on the horizon. So, Andrew, thanks for being with us. As I mentioned there, you spent decades sort of looking into the secrets of the British establishment. Where did that instinct come from? And were you always that kid that didn't necessarily believe the official story that you were told?
Well, I think it's come, I mean, now realize from in sense, growing up in the establishment and not always being very happy with the way it behaved. I mean, going right back to school bullies. But it's really it developed. I started off as a literary biographer. I wrote a book on John Buchan, the writer. And it was only when I really began to write about spies and then about the royal family, I realized that we have curated narrative, that the real story is often hidden, either because documents are never released or destroyed, or people lie. And there's always this rather symbiotic relationship. And so all the books really since Guy Burgess in 2015 have been about these cover-ups. I do think Brexit is part of it. I think it was just a symptom of a wider malaise, and that's a distrust of institutions and of elites, because most people seem to feel they operate only in their own interests. And we've seen, I think, greater politicization of the civil service, of the Foreign Office, of the police, of the army, diplomatic service, etc. And where people, get on because they basically do the bidding of their bosses, and there's less disinterested, so we say, work going on. I think that's particularly true of the politicization of the civil service. So I think that's it. It's that's what Trump came to power on. That was what Brexit was about, and this is now, I think, a strong feeling that the monarchy, which should be setting an example, which should be exerting moral authority, and I think in the end it comes down. I'm a trustee of the Campaign for Freedom of Information. It just comes down to more openness from public institutions, and increasingly we've seen a step backwards in freedom of information. I mean, files that used to be open are now closed, for example, are being released. The courts are adjudicating more frequently in favor of public authorities. We've got SLAPs, these legal cases that are brought to kind of shut down legalistic, journalistic investigation. And I just know from my own career in publishing that we're more reluctant to do controversial books, to hold people to account, not because we can't win the cases, but because they're so time-consuming and expensive to respond to. And so rich and powerful people are increasingly calling the shots, and the vast majority of the population, the taxpayers, are pretty appalled by this.
So you've kind of gotten into the freedom of information work that you've done. You needed a court order to get files from the National Archives. So when you set out to write about the formerly known as Prince Andrew, what was the establishment most determined that you not see? And what did that protectiveness tell you about how Britain handles its own secrets?
Well, I don't know what I wasn't supposed to see, because I wasn't allowed to see anything, really. I've been trying to get access to the files for Andrew's 2001 to 2011, when he was a public servant, these files should be available in the National Archives under the 20-year rule. And I've spent, I don't know, hundreds of FOIs have gone out, and they've used every possible exemption to not reveal this information. And this information would be helpful because it would show, for example, who was escorting him on these trips. I know from talking to diplomats that he brought his daughters, Jeffrey Epstein, people like David Rowlands, people who were basically bankrolling him and his ex-wife, and then basically setting them up to do business on the side, helped by some of these diplomats. So that's an area I think clearly one would be interested to know more about. And they've kind of stopped. But I mean, a lot of the diplomats, I would say 90% of them refused to talk to me. The Foreign Office told diplomats not to talk to me. Now, here we have something called the Hillsborough Law, which basically says public official, if there's a criminal act, they have a higher loyalty than to the government, to the Crown, to actually reveal what was going on. And here was someone who was involved in sex trafficking, who was involved the Official Secrets Act by leaking sensitive information he was being given, both commercial and diplomatic. And yet this has all been shut down. And that's why I'm so keen that there should be a parliamentary inquiry into his time as a trade envoy with these former heads of UKTI, the ambassadors, but they're all hiding behind different things. At the moment, the line is that there's a criminal investigation going on and we can't jeopardize that. But this is a classic establishment cover-up. Kick this thing into touch, make it appear we're doing something very performative. We'll make some announcements, and then we'll say, well, we tried, but actually we couldn't make the charges stick, or he's not going to get a fair trial, or he's not a public official. I mean, we're all being prepared for that. And that's all part of the culture of deference and secrecy in this country, which work on the basis of patronage and pressure. And I saw time and time again with the Andrew book that stories were brought by the press to the palace. They were dismissed. When they were found to be true, they were then legal threat. And there were various things like refusing to give access to the media to members of the royal family if they ran stories, a famous episode with ABC Television and Amy Robach. So it's a pretty cynical operation. And those who play ball will be given preferment, and those who don't will find that their careers are curtailed. And that was the problem with the protection officers and the diplomats, etc., who tried to raise the alarm.
Is this an institution covering for individuals, or is it bigger? Is it a whole state kind of quietly managing a myth that it's telling itself?
I think this is endemic corruption in institutions. I mean, the line with Andrew was, here were two bad apples, but the rest of the institution is fine. But then you find that there are others, including the king, who are doing cash for honours. You discover that they knew all about Andrew's activities and covered it up. And that goes back to the late Queen Elizabeth. And so this is actually about institutional corruption more than actually individual. We've seen it with Peter Mandelson, the former British ambassador in the States, a great cover-up there of how he was appointed when he should never have been appointed, a man with a very dubious track record. And this is the problem. I was talking to a protection officer yesterday for the royal family, whose job was vetting in government departments, and he said it was a joke that you could do the vetting, show that people were totally unsuitable for the job because of particular problems, and yet they would still be pushed through because the politicians or whoever wanted them, and that's not how the system should work, and that's why the trust in all these institutions is being weakened.
Andrew, if we go beyond the royal family, obviously the UK in the last decade has had 6 prime ministers since 2016. Keir Starmer now, it looks like he's on his way out. At least that's what everyone except he himself believes. He's got the worst approval record, I think, for a sitting prime minister ever, even below that of Liz Truss. And now we have Reform, which is this sort of far-right party that looks set to be in control of the next government. Obviously, we'll see what happens. But how do you read all of this, especially as a former, as someone who ran for office as a conservative MP? Is this a run of bad leaders, or is it symptoms of a country that genuinely no longer knows what it is and how to run itself?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would describe myself as a liberal Tory, so sort of centre right. And I found even then, when I stood, which is over 30 years ago, the problem was that the selection committees, the parliament, the political activists tend to be on the extremes, and they tend to want to have more people that reflect their views. So they would have more right-wing candidates and Conservatives and more left-wing candidates and Labour. And there was this sort of entryism that went on. It's been going on for a long time. I think, the middle has disappeared in British politics. I mean, it's bizarre because, there are lots of people like me who are looking for someone that we can vote for. We don't find it. People have lost faith middle in democratic politics, and they're looking for more authoritarian solutions, whether it's the Greens and Prime Ministers, the left wing of the Labour Party on the left, or reform on the right. It is extraordinary. And so we've had this sort of fragmentation of British politics, and we're moving towards more unstable government. We've also seen a breakdown in authority in the parties, less cabinet loyalty. And I think it's just, again, back to, in the old days, there were people who went into to politics through a sense of public duty. They were not always, they were pragmatic rather than politically sort of obsessives, but they just wanted good, straight government. And those people have been pushed out. They're not being selected. They don't want to make the sacrifices you have to make. The demands of politics are clearly extraordinary on things like family life. So a lot of good people give up and don't want to do it because of that. And we just have very low caliber politicians, I'm afraid, and everyone is jockeying for a position. It's all about their own personal preferment, and the whole thing has become chaotic. I think we've got shades of the Weimar Republic in the 1930s, which, of course, led to the Nazi Party. We are moving towards extremists, and all helped by the fan of social media. And the fact that there are very few, what I would call big beasts, figures of political authority that people look up to and respect. I mean, the king clearly was very effective in the use of soft power in the States the other day, but they should draw the country to a sense of national unity, as George VI did during the Second World War. And they're not really doing that because people don't really have any trust in them. They just think they're just another bunch of grifters.
Is it fair to say that this chaos didn't really spill out to the open until after the Brexit vote and sort of the chaos that we saw within the Conservative Party in terms of actually delivering on Brexit? That's obviously something that Theresa May really struggled with. And we all remember those votes in Parliament past midnight. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, clearly the problems were there before Brexit. It was one of the reasons that Cameron, allowed the referendum. The irony is that most Conservative MPs were in favour of staying in Europe. And again, this is the problem. Once William Hague introduced the leader being voted for by the party as opposed to the MPs, they began to get more and more unsuitable leaders who were appealed to the right way or to the extremists, but not to the people who had to work with them. And I think that was a real step backwards, and that created, of course, the instability and the lack of trust as well. But no, those problems were there before Brexit, but of course Brexit exacerbated them. And I think, again, the problem was that no good leader came forward. I think David Cameron actually ran a good government, but he was a chancer. He didn't do his homework. The whole thing everything got thrown in the air, and we had very low caliber MPs after that, leaders after that. I'm afraid, there were some good people. William Hague, would have made a very good prime minister. Jeremy Hunt would have made a very good leader. People like Kenneth Clarke and Michael Heseltine, these were the serious politicians, and we ended up with compromises by the constituency and the activists. So it is. I don't know how we restore stability back to politics, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem now is that no one is going to be any better than Keir Starmer. The Labour Party is divided; they're in civil war as well, and we're just going to see this constant breaking off of parties because people are less inclined to compromise. It's back to a lack of tolerance, which we see in wider society. And before, there was always a bit of give and take and a little bit of sort of working as a team, and no one seems to do that any longer.
You mentioned social media as well. I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on the pressure that we're seeing from social media and I guess the British media industry in general, how that impacts leadership at 10 Downing Street? Is that an additional pressure that makes it very challenging to last as Prime Minister with all this external pressure coming from multiple points, not just internally?
Yeah, I mean, the news agenda is moving quicker and quicker. It doesn't allow people time to the problem is politicians are not shaping the news agenda; they're kind of following it, and that doesn't lead to good government. And you're absolutely right. Social pressure, you see it even with the press, that they are pushing for clickbait. And there are very few serious, disinterested news programs now. We're moving towards the sort of American model. And that's the problem, and you see that, the press are not making money because advertising isn't there. So they are forced to go for the most sensational headlines in order to get the readers. We're seeing a lot of serious papers struggling. At the same time, there are one or two papers, programs, Channel 4 News is a good example, the Financial Times, The Economist, and my son works on a paper called Unheard, which I think is trying to be more fairer and more balanced in its coverage. And does seem to be a demand there from people, but just not a large enough demand.
So as an American, I find the monarchy fascinating. Many of my fellow Americans also find the monarchy fascinating. We, cover the stories pretty closely, mainly because we don't have one. Your whole career argues that the monarchy was the load-bearing myth of British identity, and the Queen was the unbroken line from the Second World War to the present. So was that institution doing far more political and psychological work to hold the country together than Britain ever admitted to itself? Because it does feel a bit like ever since she passed away, everything seems to feel like it's just falling apart.
I mean, I think in some ways, we delayed our acceptance of the end of empire by creating, and the Queen was sort of the font of all this, the Commonwealth. It kept a lot of these countries within the fold, maintained those relationships, and kind of smooth the passage of independence. But we've tried to create maintain these links and these allegiances. But I think the end of the Queen's reign was an important symbolic break, because she'd been there for 70 years. It was very difficult to challenge any of these things while she was there. But that, I think, was the break point, and we wouldn't see that as the end of the end of the Great British Empire. Like, she kind of was the last bit of glow on, and we had to kind of readjust ourselves. I mean, the problem also is that we've severed our links with Europe, and in many ways, America has severed its links with Britain and with Europe. And so where we were hoping to create a stronger Anglo-American alliance, and that was clearly part of all these state visits, that's been more difficult because of the Trump administration. And so Britain has been kind of left isolated, and it's back to a series of nation states like the 19th century, creating alliances and shifting loyalties. And that doesn't create a great deal of stability. So the world order, which thought was going to last forever, and the rule of the international-based rules of law, those are sort of gone now as everyone begins to operate in terms of pure. It's back to what I was saying about individuals. It's just that nations are now doing this as well.
It feels like a loaded question, but can the monarchy survive?
Yes, I think the monarchy can survive if it modernizes and reforms and adapts to the 21st century. And that means it needs more transparency and accountability. And there's I'm launching a campaign next week to try and introduce that sort of accountability. Someone described it as the last unprotected institution in Britain. And when the taxpayers are paying for their security, are paying for their housing, they want to feel that there's a sense of public duty there rather than just taking advantage for private pleasure. And they want to feel they're getting value for money. And if they're not working hard, as Prince William is often accused of being work-shy Willie, a group of royals, Princess Anne and Prince Edward and the King, who are dedicated public servants. But the problem is there are not many of them. And what we found is that the Yorks and the Sussexes kind of want the best of all the perks without any of the responsibilities and duties. And people don't really want to aren't prepared to accept that. So, I mean, they can survive, but only if they accept the need for change. If they think they can behave as they've always behaved and they won't be properly held to account, then they're actually living in cloud cuckoo land.
Andrew, I'm actually Swedish. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on whether a Scandinavian-style monarchy for the UK is inevitable.
Yes, no, I think absolutely. And from what I hear, William sees the European model as a good model, slimmed down, more low key, still respected, still has a role, still appears on special occasions. But I think this whole thing of dressing up and awarding themselves medals and all that pomp just doesn't sit easily with a modern democratic multinational society in which that link between the crown and the church, I think, is difficult when Charles has tried to reconcile it by being the keeper of all faiths. But the fact is that the Church of England is pretty much a busted flush here. I do find it extraordinary that there's still bishops in the House of Lords, and yet we've got rid of hereditary peers. We don't seem to be in favour of hereditary principle, except for the monarchy. And so we've got all these anomalies there, which need to kind of be tidied up. Personally, I think there's a role for the hereditary peers. They were disinterested. They were actually the most active, and in many ways the most independent of the peers, because they didn't owe it to any sort of political preferment and so I would like to go backwards in many ways to something which I think was a better system. I mean, what we have now, a placeman placed in the House of Lords, who have basically done some service, either financial donors or people who've stood aside to let someone else stand for Parliament or whatever. And we need, people with a wider variety of backgrounds, more writers, historians, scientists, doctors. And that's not necessarily going to be the right place for it as a reforming and reviewing chamber. We've got that already in the House of Commons.
The numbers of the number of people leaving the UK is quite striking. I think in the year to mid 2025, close to 700,000 people actually emigrated from the UK, and quite a few of them are landing here in the Gulf. The UAE was one of the single biggest destinations for migrating millionaires last year. I mean, obviously, we'll see if they stay, given all the turmoil that this region is in. But when a country's own young and ambitious population start leaving in massive numbers like that, what does that tell you that politics doesn't necessarily spell out as an observer?
Yeah. I think it's very worrying. I mean, as you say, it's the two groups of people that the country most needs: the young and the wealthy. And getting rid of non-dom status, was a sort of, it's basically part of the politics of envy. I mean, I can see it tidies up things, but it's a very naive view of the world. These people, who lived in Britain and liked the fact that there was a culture here and good education. They, they could spend money here, and that money kind of circulated. But we have this ridiculous position where we spend huge sums of money training doctors, and then we give places at medical school too, so they have to go and do different things. And then even that limited number of doctors we've got, we treat them so badly that they go off to places like Australia, and we have to import doctors from other countries who are perhaps not as well qualified and don't have the language skills. And that's true of a whole series of jobs. The lung are mobile, and they will go where the opportunities lie. And I'm afraid, this government particularly, stamping out on enterprise. It's put a huge number of taxes on employers. It's reduced the chances of people getting jobs. And of course, that's against the background of AI. And I've sort of seen it very obviously this weekend. I went up to the graduation of a daughter of mine. And her, who's at Cambridge, they're clearly well educated. 4 years on, a lot of them are struggling still to get jobs. And that shouldn't be the case. And my son, a journalist who recruits people, is saying they're getting 500-600 applicants for even quite modest jobs. And this is crazy that we can't find jobs for the young who are well qualified. And at the same time, we have a larger and larger burden of people who are able to self-diagnose and are not contributing at all to society in any way. This is how Rome burnt, and it needs a sort of Mrs. Thatcher figure to come in. I mean, I don't think it's rocket science to work out, how you stimulate economy, how you close your border, and you have tougher rules for immigrants. Again, we have a Brexit, which I see again where I live, restaurants closing because they can't get the staff because the British aren't prepared to work the sort of hours that others were prepared to work. We're suffering a shortage of people in the building trade, for example, because we don't have skilled people who often came from countries like Poland. And, you see Britain shrinking, almost day by day and losing its faith in itself.
I think another as somebody who kind of shuttles between the US and the UK, I mean, everything you're describing has been what's puzzled me, particularly because I come from such an entrepreneurial nation, and yet Britain was this massive empire. Does Britain still have this vision of itself as an empire? Is their empire nostalgia?
No, I don't think most people have any interest in the empire. Clearly, lots of families have strong empire links. My father couldn't get a job here in Britain at the end of the Second World War, and he went to work in Africa and then Bermuda. My great-grandfather went to India and was able within the empire was able to have a standard of living and a career that he perhaps couldn't have had here. So, but that isn't really happening here. I mean, the new empire are places like Dubai, but we're also seeing people going to, Italy and Portugal. There are certain tax advantages to go. I think, we spend far too little on research and development. We are losing good students to, for example, the States and elsewhere. My daughter's contemporaries went to places like Holland, for example, a lot cheaper, courses taught in English, greater opportunities. So we all the things that we seem to, have a strength in, we don't seem to be, exploiting. And of course, this just creates resentments, which, of course, the extreme right and the extreme left are able to exploit as if somehow they have the answers. And of course, they don't, so we just repeat the patterns. It'll just be we're just shifting different sorts of people making the same mistakes. But yes, the entrepreneurial instinct is gone, I think. I mean, there are bright people who are trying to do startups and things, but they often find it very difficult to get the seed capital. Banks aren't very good at loaning. They're very risk adverse. As I say, research and development, which is, so much better in places like America and Germany. And also, we still have this culture of arts culture. People don't go and study sciences and medicine in the way, for example, the Asian communities do, law. We're all still doing English and anthropology, thinking that will make a great rounded person, which it does, but it doesn't provide the sort of education that a country needs.
Poland's economy is set to overtake the UK's in the next few years. And all of the issues that we've just discussed are, I think, probably at this point widely known. Perhaps maybe not, maybe people don't want to accept that it's true, but they're there and we see them. What is the solution? I mean, if you were in a position to make policy, what would you be doing to turn the ship around?
I think Poland's economy is partly being shaped by the money it's spending on defense. And, we should be spending more on defense for our own self-protection, apart from anything else. And I think of infrastructure, which is often talked about, we don't seem to be able to do. That would help stimulate the economy. I think you need to have proper regulation and safeguards. But at the same time, I wouldn't place taxes on, national insurance going up, taxes on employers, making it more difficult to employ people, and also to get rid of them if they're not up to it. I would certainly be reviewing the welfare budget, and I think have much stricter conditions about paying welfare. I mean, I think of course, we have a duty to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. But there are an awful lot of people who are perfectly in a situation to work who choose not to. We need to make work more attractive than not working. But I think, again, putting money into research and development, putting money into the universities, I would go back to the days when I went to university where it was free, but just have fewer people going to university and make vocational courses more attractive. We are seeing an increasing number of people who are bypassing university, don't want to build up debt, and going into either straight into jobs or into some sort of technical training. We need to kind of encourage that. So there, I think there are a lot of things that we could do. I do think that we need to, we have huge demands of it. We're a small country on medical, housing, all these things. So we need to really look at that. And I think part of the benefit system is one of the reasons that people kind of take the trouble to come all the way to Britain rather than stay where some of the stopovers where they've been. And a lot of this dealing with refugees has to be done on a supranational. And we have responsibilities for those who are refugees, but we need to police that properly, and certainly we need to look at our economic migrants in a slightly more ruthless way.
Does it bother you how the UK is seen on the world stage? Because it has become a bit of a laughingstock.
So, of course, I'm proud of my country, and I have slightly a difference of allegiances because actually there isn't a drop of English blood in me. I'm half Scottish and half French, and grew up in other countries. But so I kind of feel myself as a citizen of the world. I feel myself as a European, as a Scotsman. But yeah, of course, I've spent my last 40 years working in Britain, and there's so much that is so wonderful about Britain. And it's sad to see it sort of shifting down. We were big players. We were a nuclear power. We use this extraordinary literature and music and art. And, I think we still do it, but not quite in the same way. And, we did create this extraordinary empire not that long ago and kept it until not that long ago. And yet here we are, as you say, behind Poland and just have no confidence in ourselves. And that is rather sad.
Who in British public life do you think manages to tell an honest national story about what the UK is today versus selling a comfortable, perhaps dated myth about the country?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, of course, there are journalists and writers and historians and academics who are all doing this. I do think some of those politicians, the Ken Clarks and the Michael Heseltines, they I think were quite realistic. Jeremy Hunt of the present generation is pretty realistic about things. But it's very hard to see many people, speaking truth to power and really speaking out. Politicians don't dare do so. It's only really some of the journalists, the Rod Littles, the Peter Oborns, often who are kind of pushed out of the mainstream because they don't sort of subscribe to the sort of view of most journalists. It's very difficult to not be part of the pack and to sort of plow your own furrow. So I think, unfortunately, there are very few who are really raising some of these really big questions. We need that sort of leadership. It's missing at the moment.
I think, if empire nostalgia is at a dead end and Britain needs a new story about it and no one seems able to tell one, you're a storyteller. How do we tell a new story?
Well, we need to look at what other countries do. I think of France, which has retained a lot of its traditions. When they have their problems in the banlieue. There is a very strong sense of being French. They still, I think, have retained a very strong national identity, and that's what we need to do. We've sort of been taken over. And so we have, Sharia law almost operating in certain places. And that's wrong. I think we should all be, in some ways, saluting the flag as they do in the States. Do that very well. People do, they still, have their very obvious cuisine and their way of behaving and their, as say, national identity, which we've kind of lost. It's kind of been just sort of become a smudge. And, there are things that draw us together, football and sport, cricket. But otherwise, it's difficult to see what kind of binds us together. You're absolutely right. It was the monarchy, but for the monarchy, it is for increasingly modest number of people now. Certainly, my children have no interest in the monarchy. It doesn't have any relevance to their lives whatsoever.
It's interesting what you said about the US. I mean, me and Suzanne, we talk about this quite a bit, that anyone can become American. It doesn't matter where you're born in the world. You move to America, you assimilate, but there's also this sort of hyphenated identity, which actually, as someone who lived in London for 12 years and obviously spent time in other parts of the UK as well, I think it does exist in the UK in a way that it does not in a lot of other European countries. It's not the same as the US, but you can be British, Indian, British Nigerian at the same time. So that's quite interesting. On immigration, I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe actually in the past couple of years. And one thing that I always found quite striking in the past was even EU members, they pushed back very hard on immigration. Most immigrants that arrive on European shores, they tend to settle in Western European countries, bigger economies, probably, nicer societies, easier societies to integrate in. But what's so striking about Central and Eastern Europe is the fact that they've managed to preserve their demographics. And in some ways, it makes these countries more interesting to visit and perhaps even to live in, because they have a stronger sense of national identity. Do you think in the UK that we need to sort of expand on the national identity to actually make it more representative of what the UK is today? And perhaps there's some lessons to be drawn there for other European countries as well, which is always the argument that I make when it comes to the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a good point about, being British Indian. We benefit from these cultures coming in. And, I love, for example, Indian food. I mean, I was very struck. I was in Zurich last weekend, and they were, I would say, almost every face there was white. Which is, you don't really sort of notice. Otherwise, we're so used in London to it being a real melting pot of all sorts of races. So that, slightly surprised me. But I suppose the problem, Britain is slightly different because we clearly have obligations to the empire. We had to take people in who, places like Uganda and elsewhere where people's lives were threatened, and we had obligations. So, but I'm just thinking of the Swedish example, and how Swedish society has changed enormously in the last few years because of immigration. And the reaction there and things. And I mean, in some ways, it'd be fascinating to hear where does Sweden go? Is it too late for Sweden, or can a lot of those values were there and that national identity be restored? Because it was always a very law-abiding place, and now clearly there are real problems and tensions.
Yeah, I mean, Sweden is a really interesting one because my mom was probably among the first set of immigrants that arrived in the early 80s. There was some immigration in the 70s and 60s. She's from Ethiopia, so she arrived in Sweden as a refugee. And growing up in the 90s, it was always quite striking to me that we had massive populations that in some cases didn't want to integrate, but then also you have a society that's not very welcoming. And I always found that the UK was more welcoming in that sense. But it's an interesting question, because what do you do when you've altered the demographics of a country and, the electorate didn't necessarily support it? So it becomes very challenging because you can never really reverse that. And I always make the argument, and I do want to talk about this more in the future, that we need to evolve national identity in Sweden in a way that I think that the UK has, whereby you can be Syrian Swedish, for example. And obviously, that I think with the Syrian civil war, that's when demographics changed really dramatically in Sweden, just like Germany. Obviously, a lot of people praised Angela Merkel for that initially, but now when we look back on her legacy, that's something that she's being heavily criticized for. And the same thing applies to Sweden.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose all these things are about scale. We have this extraordinary situation in Britain where some, second and third generation immigrants haven't even learned English. If there's a language test, if the only way is to speak the language of the country you've moved to, then that clearly helps with the assimilation and the integration and the building of the loyalties. You in some ways have to kind of divide your loyalties between the two languages that you're speaking.
I wanted to go back to you've mentioned a lot about the law in the UK and the legal system. And I think in terms of sort of historic legacy, the British legal system has been something that, is a point of pride. And many other countries have looked to it and followed it. That being said, as geopoliticos here, we often discuss this trend that seems to be popular to have the people of Britain elect a prime minister, and then the party stages an internal coup to push them out. And that just doesn't feel very democratic, because the people have elected a prime minister, and then yet a smaller group of people decide whether this person, can be forced to resign or not.
No, I agree. And I think, people felt that they were electing a moderate Labour government, along the lines of Tony Blair. And now the candidates all seem to be from the left of the party, who would now be introducing wealth taxes and mansion taxes, and will be in some ways further creating economic problems rather than solving them. And you're absolutely right. I'm a great believer that if, for example, someone resigns as an MP in one party, they must stand for election rather than just carry on in that parliament with their new colours. And the same with a change of leader. They need to test that against the electorate. But of course, no one wants to surrender power voluntarily, so that's not what happens. But I agree. I think we should have these rules. But in some ways, if we had people had to stand for election in these circumstances, we might have more stability. They might be thinking twice about replacing Keir Starmer, or people giving up and going across the floor to a different party. If there was a danger they might actually lose their seat. And I think what's so fascinating from my experience in politics is even the best candidates have a very small personal vote. People vote by party. So, I think they should be allowed to make that decision if the person changes the party and they are not representing the person who they thought they were voting for.
I think the world has been very unstable. It has been an increasingly chaotic time. It's been, this year's been a dumpster fire, to say it uneloquently. That being said, it seems like Keir Starmer has been able to manage, so to speak, President Trump. And King Charles had a very successful trip to Washington. His address, his congressional address, was a masterclass in diplomacy and I would dare to say even putting President Trump in his place without him even realizing it. Now, that being said, it seems that the drama around Keir Starmer has kind of died down a bit, but do you think he should remain or should he resign?
Well, we have this very unstable position where he's stuck and nothing really can happen. And while we wait for the king over the water, Andy Burnham, if he does win the by-election. So it's difficult to know. I think responsible government would be to work with Keir Starmer rather than, this jockeying for power. But politicians are all about ambition, and they saw a weakness and an opportunity there. I would slightly sort of take issue with Starmer and his relationship with Trump, because I don't has been a great relationship. Starmer has kind of acquiesced to Trump, and Trump as a bully has taken advantage of that. The only way to deal with people like Trump is to stand up to them. Italians and even the French have done to a certain extent. So I don't think, relations between the two countries are great. You're absolutely right. Charles basically did some very subtle pushback. It was a talk as much for Congress as it was for and the American people as it was for Trump. But, Trump may have professed, delighted at all without realizing, the undercurrents of the talk. But it's not going to really change policy. We got a few concessions on whiskey, but that's about it. Trump will go back to behaving as he was before. And I think it is worrying. Anglo-American relations are in a tricky position. We're seeing less intelligence sharing. We've got a new British ambassador who's been criticized for some of the comments. We've just lost his number two, who was the acting ambassador, and on a whole series of areas where we work very closely together, not least trade. There are tensions, and clearly there are problems with the war in Iran and different attitudes towards that. So it's a real mess, and I think my own feeling is it can only change with a change of American government, and even then it may not change. We may get Mario Rubio or J.D. Vance, or we may get the Democrats not being that dissimilar. That the changes in America have been permanent rather than a temporary aberration.
Andrew, as we begin to wrap up, I'm curious to know, after everything that you've documented, the royal secrecy, the political churn, are you ultimately hopeful about the future of the UK, or do you think that the UK is in for sort of a longer reckoning before the country works itself out?
No, I think I've come to terms with the fact that we are now a very minor power. We've punched above our weight for many years. Maybe that was an illusion. But I think, we now need to accept where we are. So, no, I don't think it's going to be in my lifetime. I hope my own children will see Britain come back to to being at least a sort of middle power, if not one of the great powers. But I do find it frightening that, it is now being seen in terms of power blocks. We're back to these shifting alliances, and that doesn't create stable government. The Cold War was frightening, but at least it was certain. We knew where everyone stood, and people were nervous about breaking any of those arrangements that they had. At the moment, we live in a very unstable world with more and more people with nuclear weapons, and more and more unstable people in positions of power.
Definitely, and I think as we move into this multipolar world, it'll be very interesting to keep an eye on the UK and see what the role of the UK will be going forward, because there's a lot of power throughout history there that can be tapped into, but you have to deploy it the right way on the world stage. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting to hear about your perspective, especially through a sort of the fusion of a royal and a political lens and bringing everything together. Really appreciate your time. And thanks to all our viewers for tuning in and supporting Global Power Shifts. You can find all of our episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Please follow us, subscribe, and maybe even leave a review. On behalf of myself, Jim Stenman, and Suzanne Kianpour, we'll see you again next time. Thanks.